Hello, and welcome to the new Mastering Forms series. This video is going to introduce you to the different components available for forms, as well as some of the options behind the scenes. To get started, what I'm going to do is create a simple add-on and a fake stream, just so that we can take a look at how form builders are generated out of the box. So to do that, let's hop over to our terminal and make an add-on. Anomaly.module.example, and now I'm just going to create a dummy stream. Make stream, let's call this widgets, and we're going to put it in the example add-on. Great. Now let's hop over to PhpStorm here and go see what we've got in the new widget namespace that was generated for us. The form builder, if you open it up, is going to have some components available for you right away. So any of the builders, what you're going to notice is that things are usually defined as an array. This is a definition. So these are field definitions, these are skip definitions, action definitions. It's just kind of a term that I use for the very basic input that you're going to configure the builder with. So if we run down the line here, fields is pretty self-explanatory. These are going to be the fields to display in this particular form. By default, what we see here is nothing, although if we were to load this form, we get every single field that would be assigned to the widget model or the widget stream. And the reason that is because this pattern here, when you use make stream, it sets up the pattern in a very specific way. So the model is detected, the stream can be guessed, a lot of these things can be assumed for you. So by default, it's going to pick up all the stuff that you did beforehand, all of the fields that you assigned via migrations when you're setting up, and do a lot of guesswork and take a lot of the pain of setup out of the equation. So you can override these things, but by default, it does this kind of for you. And we'll get into how that magic, I hate to call it that, but how it does this guessing and automation behind the scenes. We'll get into that later. So the fields are where you would define fields. If you wanted to override a field, for instance, you can include all fields, and then let's say we had a slug and we wanted to change the label for some reason, I don't know. Then we would just override the label like this, and it would use all of the configuration that we set up beforehand, except for the slug. It would use everything and just override the label. And we can override configuration and whatnot, and it would get merged into what we defined earlier in the migrations. So that's a good thing to know when you need to, for example, disable the slug on, if we wanted to disable this in edit mode, then we would do something like this. Or if we wanted to disable it permanently, we could do this. We could use a closure if we had a field handler, but just a good thing to know how to do, and we'll get into a lot more of that later. The next thing is going to be skips, and this is if you, again, all fields by default are going to be displayed, and so if we want to remove one of those fields, for example, again, the slug, we would just put the field slug there, and it would remove it from the form. I'll keep all this stuff up here. The form actions are going to be like save and continue, save and exit, save and do something, or whatever action that you want to provide. By default, it will use save and create for create mode forms, and when you're in edit, it will use update and save and exit. And that's done, it's guessed if there's nothing defined later down the road, but to give an example, you could easily just force one button, save, and this works just like button definitions, for example, in sections for modules. You define the text, you define a redirect, you define the type, you can define an icon, things like that, and the options are all documented. Form buttons are going to be things like cancel or view. These are straight up links, and they don't submit the form. So you can, again, define these very similar to actions, very similar to any button in the system. These use the button definition, so that's what those do. Pretty nice if, for example, if you have a page form and you want to have, when you're editing it, you can update, and then maybe there's a button to view rather than having to back out to the table and then go and view that way. That's something I plan on putting into the Pages module, but just as an example of how those might be used. This defaults to cancel. The form options is just a collection of key value options, and these can be used in a number of different ways. One would be forcing a redirect. If we wanted to redirect home, for example, or admin example, we could define it there. Otherwise, it's going to take the redirect from the action, and there's some guessing that goes along there, even though you can force it. Out of the box, the point of builders is to make life as simple as possible for you. It's going to make all of the best guesses, all of the best assumptions for the developer, and let you set up things super quick, and then you append as needed, or you customize as needed, which usually is very little, but it's good to know that out of the box there's a lot of this stuff that's already done for you. Options, for example, there's a few things like the views to use for the form wrapper and the form layout that are done for you, and you can override them by simply defining them in options yourself. If we move on down, the form sections is going to handle the layout of the form. So the sections are the panels, the HTML panels are stacked on top of each other. You can have tabs in there, but that defines what fields go where and how they're displayed. And then finally, the assets is an array of let's see here, let's give an example. Collection to assets to load. So you have your collection here, and then you pile in the assets that you want to add to that here. And this helps you prevent having to override a view just to include more assets. You can load them from here. So those are the basic components that come out of the box. And if you notice, when we go up here to the top, we extend the form builder, and this is pretty much 99% of the forms in the system, and all the add-ons extend the form builder. So let's take a look at that and see what else we have available. If we look in here, the first thing we'll see is the Ajax flag, and that's going to cause the form submission to use Ajax and an Ajax response as well. We've got the handler, and the handler class is, again, all the stuff is automated and guessed for us by default, but you can provide your own handler for adding logic. Let's say you want to save the form and then maybe post to I don't know, Salesforce or something. You can define a handler to do that. The validator, you can customize the validation setup and structure. Usually this, you rarely have to touch this, but if you need some heavy-duty validation overriding, then you can define your own validator class on the form builder. The form repository is responsible for getting the entry that you're editing or creating out of the database and then putting one into the database. This is guessed again for you based on if you're using just a generic Eloquent model or if you're using an entry model. The model is the actual class name, and this is again guessed for you. And this one is a little tricky, and we'll get into how this works later, but because this form builder is here, it looks up a level and lops off form builder and replaces it with model by default. You can always provide your own, and very often I do when I'm working with things like outside packages and building a form around a generic model. The entry is going to be the entry that you are editing. It can be an ID or an object. The fields configuration we already saw, skips we saw, actions, buttons, options, sections, assets. These are all things that we've already covered. The save flag is going to be if for whatever reason we need to halt the ability to save. Let's say everything is working and it would normally save, but we want to, for whatever reason, intercept that. We can set the save to false. Read-only will cause all fields to be rendered with the read-only HTML attribute. And then the form object. And when you're working with builders, the builder takes all of your input, all of your array input, the very simple stuff, and what it does is it builds it almost like a factory would. It builds it into its counterpart objects. So when you define fields, you end up with a field collection of field types, all configured and ready to go. When you define actions, you end up with action classes with redirect, response handlers, and things like that. But instead of defining all that stuff up front and doing all that legwork, all you have to do is provide a few array definitions, and everything else is done for you. The form object is what the form actually builds. So the form is going to hold the collections and the actual objects from the builder. So the builder does its build, comes up with all these objects and loads them into the form, and then the form is what's actually doing the heavy lifting. And if you go down, we'll get into some of the methods, and we'll take a look at that later. But for now, I think I'm going to leave it at this. You've got a lot to kind of look at. Now you know when you use a form builder where to look and what some of this stuff does. And in the next video, we'll start getting into the build process and see how these arrays are taken from their definition and moved into an object and instantiated into an actual form.